She baked cookies for church socials and knitted sweaters for grandchildren. Her smile was warm, her embrace comforting. But behind Velma Barfield's grandmother facade lurked something monstrous, a serial killer who turned love into a weapon, trust into poison, and family bonds into death sentences. In the autumn of 1977, Velma Bullard Barfield embodied everything Americans expected from a Southern grandmother. At 46, she lived quietly in a modest trailer on Honeycutt Road in rural Robeson County, North Carolina, surrounded by tobacco fields that stretched toward horizons painted amber by the fading light of Indian summer. Her neighbors knew her as a devout woman who never missed Sunday service at Pentecostal Holiness Church, whose apple pies won blue ribbons at county fairs, and whose gentle voice could soothe crying babies with lullabies passed down through generations. Velma's transformation into the archetypal grandmother figure had been gradual, emerging from the ashes of a turbulent marriage that had ended with her husband Thomas Burke's sudden death in 1969. Widowhood had seemed to soften her rough edges, replacing the volatile temper that family members whispered about with a maternal warmth that drew people into her orbit like moths to flame. She had remarried briefly to Jennings Barfield in 1970, but his death from heart failure the following year had left her alone again, a tragic figure deserving sympathy and support from her tight-knit community. The rural landscape of southeastern North Carolina in the late 1970s provided the perfect backdrop for Velma's carefully constructed persona. This was a region where family bonds ran deeper than the Cape Fear River, where trust was earned through generations of shared hardship, and where a woman's worth was measured in her ability to nurture and protect those she loved. Velma understood these unwritten rules, instinctively, weaving herself into the social fabric with the skill of someone who had studied human nature as intensely as she had once memorized Bible verses. Her trailer on Honeycutt Road became a gathering place for neighbors seeking comfort during difficult times. When elderly Stuart Taylor's arthritis flared during harsh winters, Velma appeared with homemade soup and gentle hands that could ease pain better than any prescription. When young mothers struggled with colicky infants, she offered her rocking chair and the wisdom that came from raising her own 4 children through poverty and uncertainty. But beneath this carefully cultivated surface, something far more sinister was taking root. The same hands that kneaded dough for communion bread were learning to measure doses of poison with scientific precision. The same voice that sang hymns on Sunday mornings was beginning to whisper lies that would cover the tracks of murder. The same heart that appeared to overflow with Christian charity was calculating the monetary value of human life with the cold efficiency of an accountant. By 1977, Velma Barfield had already claimed her first victims, though no one in Robeson County suspected that their beloved grandmother was anything more than a woman touched by unusual tragedy. The deaths that would eventually expose her true nature were still to come, waiting in the shadows like predators stalking unsuspecting prey. Tell me in the comments, have you ever met someone whose kindness felt too perfect, too deliberate? What made you suspicious? To understand the monster that Velma Barfield became, one must journey back to her beginnings in rural South Carolina during the Great Depression, when poverty carved deep scars into the landscape and human souls alike. Born Velma Margie Bullard on October 29, 1932, she entered a world where survival demanded sacrifices that would have broken stronger spirits, where children learned early that love was conditional and trust a luxury few could afford. Her father, Murphy Bullard, was a tobacco farmer whose failed crops and mounting debts drove him to seek solace in bootleg whiskey that burned away his capacity for tenderness. The small frame house on the outskirts of Cumberland County echoed with his drunken rages, the sound of fists meeting flesh, and the terrified whimpers of children who learned to become invisible when the violence erupted. Velma's mother, Lily, bore 9 children in conditions that would have challenged the most devoted mother, her dreams slowly suffocating under the weight of endless pregnancies and her husband's unpredictable fury. Velma occupied the precarious middle position among the Bullard children, old enough to witness her parents' brutal fights, yet young enough to absorb the lesson that violence was simply another expression of emotion, no different from laughter or tears. She learned to read the subtle signs that preceded her father's explosions, the way his jaw tightened when bills arrived, the particular slouch of his shoulders when crop prices fell, the dangerous glitter in his eyes when neighbors whispered about the Bullard's latest shame. The family's frequent moves from one sharecropper's shack to another taught Velma that stability was an illusion, that relationships were temporary arrangements that could be severed without warning when circumstances demanded change. She watched her mother's spirit gradually erode under the constant stress, observing how illness became the only acceptable escape from responsibilities that threatened to crush the life from worn-out bodies. School provided little refuge from the chaos at home. Velma's irregular attendance and shabby clothes marked her as one of the poor children whom teachers tolerated rather than nurtured. Her grades reflected not lack of intelligence, but the impossibility of concentrating on arithmetic when your stomach cramped with hunger and your ears strained for sounds of violence from home. She learned that education was a privilege reserved for children whose parents could afford books and clean clothes, whose homes offered quiet corners for study rather than battlegrounds for survival. But Velma also learned lessons that weren't taught in any classroom. How to manipulate adults through strategic displays of helplessness. How to deflect attention from family shame through carefully constructed lies. And most importantly, how to present whatever face would earn her the protection or resources she needed to survive. These skills, honed through years of navigating domestic violence and grinding poverty, would later prove invaluable when she discovered that some people were worth more dead than alive. By the time she reached adolescence, Velma had already mastered the art of deception that would define her adult relationships. The foundation for murder had been laid in childhood trauma that nobody recognized or addressed. Would you have recognized the warning signs in young Velma, or dismissed her behavior as typical responses to a difficult childhood? At 17, Velma Bullard escaped her father's house through marriage to Thomas Burke, a 26-year-old tobacco farmer who promised stability and respectability that seemed like salvation after years of chaos and shame. The wedding took place in 1949 at a small Baptist church in Cumberland County, witnessed by relatives who whispered prayers that this union might finally bring peace to the troubled Bullard girl whose childhood had been marked by too much violence and too little love. Thomas Burke appeared to be everything Velma needed: steady, hard-working, and blessed with the kind of quiet strength that could anchor a woman whose early life had been defined by unpredictability. He owned 40 acres of decent tobacco land inherited from his father, along with a modest farmhouse that represented luxury compared to the succession of sharecropper shacks where Velma had spent her formative years. For the first time in her life, she had a permanent address, a telephone, and neighbors who knew her as Mrs. Burke, rather than that Bullard girl. The early years of marriage brought the children that small-town society expected from young wives. Ronald arrived in 1950, followed by Kim in 1952, Pam in 1954, and finally Ronnie Jr. in 1957. Velma threw herself into motherhood with the intensity of someone trying to rewrite history, determined to provide her children with the stability and affection that had been absent from her own upbringing. She learned to can vegetables, to sew clothes from flour sack patterns, and to stretch Thomas's modest farming income through careful budgeting that would have impressed her Depression-era parents. But beneath the surface normalcy, troubling patterns were already emerging. Neighbors noted Velma's explosive temper when discipline was required, her tendency to oscillate between smothering affection and cold withdrawal depending on her mood. The children learned to read her emotional barometer as carefully as she had once watched her father's warning signs, walking on eggshells when her smile became too bright or her voice took on that particular edge that preceded punishment. Thomas's steady nature initially seemed to balance Velma's volatility, his calm presence serving as a buffer between his wife's unpredictable moods and their children's need for security. But as the years passed, even his patience began to wear thin under the constant strain of managing a household where emotional explosions could erupt without warning. where normal family interactions were complicated by undercurrents of tension that no one could name but everyone could feel. The first cracks in their marriage became visible when Thomas began staying later at work, finding reasons to visit neighbors, or simply disappearing for hours without explanation. He no ever spoke openly about his growing unease with his wife's behavior, but those who knew him well noticed the way his shoulders sagged when he walked toward home, the reluctance in his step, as he approached the house where Velma waited with smiles that never quite reached her eyes. By 1960, Thomas Burke had begun to wonder if he had rescued Velma from her troubled past or simply provided her with better tools for creating new forms of chaos. Imagine being married to someone whose love felt more like possession. Would you recognize the danger before it was too late? The transformation of Velma Burke's marriage from troubled partnership to toxic battleground accelerated through the 1960s, as prescription medications became readily available to housewives seeking relief from the mundane stresses of rural life. What began as legitimate treatment for headaches and anxiety gradually evolved into a dangerous dependency that altered Velma's personality in ways that even her own children struggled to recognize or understand. Dr. Harold Hutchins, the family physician in nearby Lumberton, had initially prescribed Valium and Librium to help Velma cope with what she described as nervous exhaustion, brought on by the demands of raising 4 active children while managing a farm household. The pills promised relief from the constant tension that seemed to coil in her chest like a living thing. The anxiety that made her hands shake when Thomas looked at her with growing suspicion. The depression that descended like fog over her days when she contemplated the vast difference between her dreams and reality. But the medications that were supposed to restore balance to her life instead created new forms of chaos. The pills made her feel disconnected from her own emotions, able to observe her family's interactions, as if watching strangers perform in a play where she had forgotten her line. Sometimes she felt nothing at all. Not love for her children, not anger at their misbehavior, not fear when Thomas raised his voice in frustration. Other times, the chemicals amplified her emotions until minor irritations became rage that seemed to possess her completely. The children learned to identify which version of their mother they were facing based on subtle cues that adults would have missed. When her pupils were pinpricks and her voice had that particular dreamy quality, they knew to stay quiet and avoid drawing attention. When she had gone too long without pills and her hands trembled with withdrawal, they scattered like mice when she entered a room, recognizing the signs of an approaching storm. Thomas watched his wife's deterioration with the helpless frustration of a farmer watching crops fail, despite his best efforts. He had married a troubled but passionate woman. Now he lived with a stranger who smiled at inappropriate moments and flew into rages over imagined slights. Her behavior at church functions became increasingly erratic. Her conversations with neighbors took on a rambling quality that made people uncomfortable, and her treatment of the children alternated between suffocating attention and cold neglect. The pills also awakened something darker in Velma's nature, a fascination with the power that came from controlling other people's physical states. She began studying the effects of different medications with the intensity she had once reserved for Bible study, learning which combinations produced which symptoms, which dosages caused which reactions. She experimented with giving the children different amounts of children's aspirin, observing their responses with scientific curiosity that had nothing to do with maternal concern. By 1969, Velma Burke had discovered that medication could be used for purposes far removed from healing. Thomas had no idea that his wife was already planning his death. Tell me in the comments, have you ever witnessed someone's personality change dramatically due to prescription drugs? What warning signs did you notice? On April 4, 1969, Thomas Burke collapsed in his tobacco field while preparing the soil for spring planting. The 44-year-old farmer, who had never missed a day of work due to illness in his adult life, suddenly found himself doubled over with stomach cramps that felt like hot knives twisting in his abdomen. His hired hand, Junior Parnell, helped him to the house where Velma met them at the door with an expression of concern that seemed almost rehearsed in its perfection. The symptoms that followed over the next 3 days created a medical mystery that would puzzle doctors and devastate the Burke family. Thomas experienced violent nausea that prevented him from keeping down even small sips of water, diarrhea that left him dehydrated and weak, and abdominal pain that morphed from sharp stabs to deep, burning agony that no position could relieve. Dr. Hutchins, called to the Burke farmhouse on the second day of Thomas's illness, found a patient whose symptoms suggested food poisoning or gastroenteritis, though the severity and persistence were unusual. Velma transformed into the perfect caregiver during her husband's final illness, never leaving his bedside except to prepare broths and teas that she insisted would restore his strength. She monitored his temperature with the devotion of a trained nurse, adjusted his pillows with gentle hands, and spoke to him in the soothing tones that had once calmed their children's nightmares. Neighbors who stopped by to check on Thomas came away impressed by Velma's dedication, her obvious distress at her husband's suffering, and her determination to nurse him back to health through sheer force of will. But Thomas's condition continued to deteriorate despite his wife's careful attention. On the morning of April the 7th, he suffered what Dr. Hutchins late described as cardiovascular collapse, his heart simply stopping as if the organ had been overwhelmed by toxins his body could no longer process. The death certificate listed the cause as heart failure secondary to gastroenteritis, a diagnosis that seemed reasonable given the symptoms and Thomas's previously excellent health. The funeral at Pentecostal Holiness Church drew hundreds of mourners who came to pay their respects to a man known for his honesty, hard work, and devotion to his family. Velma, dressed in black and supported by her teenage children, presented the image of a devastated widow whose world had been shattered by unexpected tragedy. Her tears seemed genuine. Her grief appeared overwhelming, and her obvious struggle to hold herself together for the sake of her children touched everyone who witnessed her pain. But buried beneath the layers of carefully constructed sorrow was a different emotion entirely, the exhilaration of someone who had discovered an ultimate form of control over another human being. Velma had learned that she could cause death through methods that appeared natural, that she could transform herself from victim to perpetrator without anyone suspecting the change. Thomas Burke's death was not a tragedy. It was Velma's graduation to murder. The insurance payout would provide her with financial resources she had never possessed, but more importantly, the successful deception had awakened an appetite for power that would demand additional victims. If you had been Thomas's doctor, would you have suspected foul play, or accepted the death as a tragic but natural occurrence? The months following Thomas Burke's death revealed a side of Velma that surprised even those who thought they knew her well. Rather than retreating into prolonged mourning as expected from a devoted wife, she seemed to bloom in widowhood, like a flower finally receiving adequate sunlight. The insurance settlement of $3,500, a substantial sum in rural North Carolina circa 1969, provided her with financial independence she had never experienced, while freedom from Thomas's increasingly suspicious scrutiny allowed her to reshape her identity in ways that would have been impossible during marriage. Velma's transformation began with small changes that accumulated into a completely different persona. She traded her conservative dresses for more fashionable clothing that emphasized her still attractive figure, began wearing makeup with a skill that suggested hours of practice in front of mirrors, and started attending social events where widows were expected to remain respectfully invisible. At church socials and community gatherings, she displayed a vivacity that made people comment on how well she was handling her grief, not knowing that grief was the one emotion entirely absent from her emotional repertoire. The children, Ronald, now 19, Kim, 17, Pam, 15, and Ronnie Jr., 12, watched their mother's metamorphosis with confusion that gradually hardened into resentment. The woman who had alternated between smothering attention and cold withdrawal during their father's lifetime now treated them more like inconvenient obligations than beloved offspring. Her interest in their daily lives became perfunctory, her discipline inconsistent, and her affection conditional upon their ability to maintain the fiction that they were a happy family adjusting well to their tragic loss. But it was Velma's sudden interest in the opposite sex that truly shocked her conservative community. Within 6 months of Thomas's burial, she was accepting invitations to dinner from men who had previously shown her nothing but respectful sympathy. Her behavior at these social encounters revealed skills at flirtation and manipulation that suggested extensive practice, as if she had been studying male psychology with the same intensity she once devoted to Bible study. The most significant relationship that Amy emerged from this period was with Jennings Barfield, a widower 13 years her senior, who owned a successful appliance repair business in neighboring Bladen County. Jennings was everything Thomas had not been: financially stable, socially connected, and blessed with the kind of easy charm that made him popular throughout the region. Their courtship proceeded with surprising speed, as if both parties understood that their needs complemented each other perfectly. What Jennings didn't realize was that Velma's needs had evolved far beyond simple companionship or financial security. She had discovered that causing death provided a form of satisfaction that no other experience could match, and she was already evaluating her new suitor's potential as both provider and victim. The insurance money from Thomas's death was disappearing faster than anticipated, spent on luxuries and social climbing that Velma considered essential investments in her new identity. She would need another source of funds soon, and Jennings Barfield was beginning to look like the perfect solution to her financial problems. Would you have been attracted to Velma's newfound confidence, or sensed something predatory beneath her charming exterior? Velma's marriage to Jennings Barfield on August 23, 1970, represented the pinnacle of her social transformation from struggling farmer's wife to respectable middle-class matron. The ceremony took place at Pentecostal Holiness Church, where Velma had mourned Thomas just 16 months earlier. But the bride who walked down the aisle bore little resemblance to the grief-stricken widow who had captured the community's sympathy. At 37, she had achieved the kind of financial security and social status that had seemed impossible during her impoverished childhood. Jennings Barfield was widely regarded as a catch, a successful businessman whose appliance repair shop served customers throughout southeastern North Carolina, a deacon at his Baptist church, and a man whose first marriage had been a model of domestic happiness until his wife's death from cancer in 1968. His decision to marry Velma surprised some members of his family who had expected him to choose a bride with a more conventional background, but his loneliness had made him vulnerable to a woman who understood exactly how to present herself as the answer to his prayers. The early months of their marriage followed a pattern that would become tragically familiar. Velma transformed herself into the perfect wife, anticipating Jennings's needs with uncanny accuracy, managing his household with efficiency that impressed his business associates, and presenting herself at social functions as an asset that enhanced his reputation rather than a liability that required explanation. She learned his routines, his preferences, his vulnerabilities, and his fears with the thoroughness of someone conducting market research. But beneath her devoted wife facade, Velma was conducting a different kind of research entirely. She studied Jennings's health with the intensity of a medical student, noting which foods disagreed with him, which medications he took for minor ailments, and how his body responded to stress or physical exertion. She began experimenting with his meals, adding small amounts of various substances to observe their effects, always ready with innocent explanations for any symptoms he might experience. The prescription medications that had become central to Velma's daily routine provided her with a laboratory for testing different compounds and dosages. Her medicine cabinet contained an impressive array of pills: Valium for anxiety, Darvon for pain, Librium for depression, and various other substances that she had acquired through doctor shopping and creative symptom descriptions. She discovered which combinations produced which effects, which dosages caused specific symptoms, and most importantly, which substances could mimic natural illness when administered correctly. Jennings began experiencing health problems within 6 months of their wedding. What started as occasional stomach upset gradually escalated to episodes of severe gastrointestinal distress that sent him to bed for days at a time. Dr. Hutchins, now serving as the Barfield family physician, diagnosed stress-related digestive issues and prescribed medication that Velma volunteered to monitor and dispense. By the spring of 1971, Jennings Barfield was living on borrowed time, though he had no idea that his devoted wife had already selected the method and timing for his death. The life insurance policy he had purchased to protect his new bride would soon make her a wealthy widow twice over. Imagine discovering that your spouse's devotion was actually detailed preparation for your murder. What signs might you have missed? March 21st, 1971, dawned bright and unseasonably warm across Bladen County, North Carolina, promising an early spring that would bring prosperity to farmers and joy to families eager to emerge from winter's confinement. For Jennings Barfield, the day began like countless others. Breakfast prepared by his devoted wife, coffee strong enough to fuel a full day's work at the appliance repair shop, and the comfortable routine of a marriage that seemed to have settled into domestic bliss after 7 months of wedded happiness. But by noon, Jennings was doubled over with stomach cramps that felt familiar yet somehow more intense than the digestive episodes that had plagued him throughout the winter. He called Velma from the shop, his voice tight with pain as he described symptoms that she received with perfectly calibrated concern. She insisted he come home immediately, promising to prepare the herbal tea that had provided relief during previous attacks, her tone conveying exactly the right mixture of worry and confidence that convinced him he was fortunate to have married such a caring woman. The attack that followed surpassed anything Jennings had previously experienced. Waves of nausea left him retching helplessly, while abdominal pain transformed from discomfort to agony that made him cry out despite his natural stoicism. Velma hovered nearby with cool cloths and soothing words, administering medications that she claimed would ease his suffering, monitoring his condition with the dedication of a trained nurse whose patient's welfare was her primary concern. Dr. Hutchins, summoned to the Barfield home on the second day of Jennings's illness, found his patient severely dehydrated and exhibiting signs of cardiovascular stress that seemed disproportionate to typical gastroenteritis. The physician's experience treating rural families had familiarized him with various forms of food poisoning and digestive ailments, but Jennings's symptoms followed a pattern that defied easy categorization. The patient's pulse was erratic, his blood pressure unstable, and his mental clarity compromised in ways that suggested systemic toxicity rather than simple stomach upset. Velma's performance during the medical examination was flawless, providing detailed accounts of her husband's symptoms while expressing appropriate anxiety about his deteriorating condition. She had maintained careful records of his temperature, fluid intake, and medication schedule, presenting herself as a model caregiver whose thoroughness impressed the doctor and reinforced the impression that everything possible was being done to ensure Jennings's recovery. But recovery was never part of Velma's plan. On the morning of March the 23rd, Jennings Barfield's heart stopped beating, his death occurring at the precise moment when the poison in his system reached lethal concentration. The death certificate listed heart failure as the immediate cause, with acute gastroenteritis as a contributing factor, a diagnosis that seemed entirely reasonable given the documented illness and the patient's lack of previous cardiac problems. The funeral drew Eve and larger crowds than Thomas Burke's service had attracted 2 years earlier, as Jennings's extensive business connections and church involvement had given him friendships throughout the region. Once again, Velma played the devastated widow to perfection, her grief appearing so genuine that even skeptics found themselves moved by her obvious pain. Tell me in the comments, at what point would you have become suspicious if you were Jennings's friend or family member? In the aftermath of Jennings Barfield's death, Velma found herself in the unusual position of being a twice-widowed woman before her 40th birthday, a status that generated considerable sympathy throughout Robeson and Bladen counties, while simultaneously raising whispered questions about her remarkable run of tragic luck. The insurance settlement from Jennings's policy, combined with the proceeds from selling his appliance repair business, provided her with financial resources that dwarfed anything she had previously imagined possible. The whispers began quietly, carried on the wind that swept across tobacco fields and through small-town beauty parlors where women gathered to exchange gossip along with hairstyling tips. "Poor Velma," they said, their voices heavy with sympathy that couldn't quite mask an undercurrent of curiosity. "Losing 2 husbands so young, both to the same kind of sickness. You have to wonder if there's some kind of curse following that poor woman around." But Velma was far from cursed. She was thriving in ways that would have shocked anyone who could see past her carefully constructed facade of grief and vulnerability. The money from 2 insurance settlements had given her independence that transcended mere financial security. For the first time in her life, she could make decisions based on her own desires, rather than the needs or expectations of others. She could experiment with different personas, test various approaches to manipulating people's emotions, and most importantly, she could take the time to perfect her technique for what she had come to think of as her special talent. The prescription medication dependency that had begun as a response to marital stress had evolved into something more sophisticated, a chemical laboratory that she managed with increasing skill and confidence. Her medicine cabinet now contained an impressive pharmacopoeia acquired through relationships with multiple doctors across several counties, each physician unaware of the other's contributions to her collection. She had learned to present different symptoms to different practitioners, to describe ailments that would result in prescriptions for specific medications, and to maintain the fiction that she was a chronic pain sufferer whose conditions required ongoing treatment. More significantly, she had begun studying the effects of these medications on other people with the systematic approach of a researcher conducting clinical trials. She tested small doses on her children when they misbehaved, observing how different substances affected their behavior, energy levels, and physical well-being. She experimented with combinations that could induce specific symptoms, nausea, drowsiness, confusion, or abdominal distress, while maintaining plausible deniability about their source. The children, now ranging in age from 13 to 21, had learned to avoid their mother when she displayed certain warning signs. They recognized the particular glitter in her eyes that preceded her experiments, the false sweetness in her voice when she offered them special treats or drinks, and the way she watched their reactions with clinical detachment that had nothing to do with maternal concern. But Velma's ambitions were expanding beyond her immediate family. She was beginning to realize that her talents could be applied to a much broader range of potential victims. The elderly, the isolated, and the trusting were all around her, waiting to be harvested. Would you have recognized the pattern if 2 people in your social circle had died from similar mysterious illnesses, or dismissed it as tragic coincidence? By 1973, Velma Barfield had perfected the art of presenting herself as exactly what people needed her to be. And in the rural communities of southeastern North Carolina, what people needed most was someone willing to care for aging relatives who required assistance with daily activities but couldn't afford professional nursing care. Velma's reputation as a devoted wife who had nursed 2 husbands through their final illnesses made her the ideal candidate for families seeking trustworthy help with their elderly loved ones. Her first client was Dolly Edwards, a 76-year-old widow whose arthritis had progressed to the point where simple tasks like cooking and cleaning had become insurmountable challenges. Mrs. Edwards's children, scattered across several states by career demands, were grateful to find someone with Velma's credentials willing to provide companionship and basic care for a reasonable fee. They were impressed by Velma's references, her obvious devotion to family values, and her gentle manner with their mother during the initial interview. Velma approached her new career with the same methodical preparation she had applied to her marriages. She studied each client's medical history, family dynamics, financial resources, and social connections with the thoroughness of an investigator building a case file. She learned their daily routines, their fears and preferences, their relationships with doctors and family members, and most importantly, their level of independence and mental acuity. The perfect caregiver persona she developed drew from her observations of truly caring individuals. Combined with her natural understanding of what made people trust and depend on others, she was patient without being condescending, helpful without being intrusive, and concerned without being overwhelming. She remembered birthdays, brought small gifts that showed thoughtfulness without suggesting inappropriate expense, and displayed exactly the right amount of Christian faith to reassure families that their loved ones were in morally sound hands. But beneath this carefully constructed exterior, Velma was conducting a different kind of assessment entirely. She evaluated each client's potential value as a source of income, either through direct payment for services or through more permanent arrangements that might involve insurance policies, wills, or valuable possessions that could be acquired through careful manipulation. She studied their relationships with family members, identifying those who were genuinely caring versus those who were simply fulfilling social obligations, calculating which deaths would generate intense investigation versus those that would be accepted as natural consequences of age and infirmity. The prescription medications that had become central to her personal chemistry experiments provided her with tools for managing her clients' behavior and health status in ways that appeared to be beneficial care. She could induce symptoms that would require increased attention and higher fees, or cause improvements that would enhance her reputation as an exceptionally skilled caregiver. Most importantly, she could gradually build tolerance for substances that would later prove useful for more permanent solutions to her financial needs. Mrs. Edwards had no idea that her new caregiver was simultaneously her potential executioner, evaluating her assets while calculating the precise timing and method for her eventual demise. The mask of compassion that Velma wore so convincingly concealed a predator who had learned to monetize murder through the exploitation of society's most vulnerable members. If you were hiring care for an elderly relative, what red flags would you watch for to avoid someone like Velma? Living in Dolly Edwards' modest frame house on the outskirts of Lumberton provided Velma with an intimate education in the psychology of elderly vulnerability that would inform her approach to future victims. At 76, Mrs. Edwards represented the perfect subject for studying how aging minds responded to subtle forms of manipulation, how physical dependency could be exploited for emotional control, and how isolation from family members created opportunities for deception that younger, more connected individuals would never present. Velma's technique was masterful in its gradual progression from genuine helpfulness to subtle domination. She began by anticipating Mrs. Edwards's needs before they were expressed, creating a sense of dependency that felt like luxury rather than loss of autonomy. She prepared meals tailored to her clients' preferences, managed household tasks with impressive efficiency, and provided conversation that ranged from local gossip to shared memories that made the elderly woman feel valued and understood. But embedded within this caring routine were small experiments designed to test Mrs. Edwards's susceptibility to suggestion and control. Velma would occasionally misplace items and then find them in locations that suggested her client's memory was failing, creating doubt about mental acuity that made Mrs. Edwards more grateful for assistance. She would describe conversations with neighbors or family members that never occurred, gauging her client's ability to distinguish between reality and fiction. Most importantly, she began managing Mrs. Edwards' medications with increasing authority, gradually assuming responsibility for dosages and timing that should have remained under medical supervision. The prescription drugs that Velma administered to her client served multiple purposes beyond their intended therapeutic effects. Small adjustments in dosage could create symptoms that required additional care, justifying higher fees while demonstrating Velma's value as a caregiver. Combinations of medications could produce confusion or drowsiness that made Mrs. Edwards more compliant and less likely to question Velma's decisions about household management or financial matters. Through careful observation and calculated manipulation, Velma learned to present herself as indispensable to Mrs. Edwards's well-being, while simultaneously creating the conditions that made such dependence necessary. She isolated her client from other potential sources of support by discouraging visits from neighbors, describing family members in ways that suggested they were too busy or uncaring to provide adequate attention, and positioning herself as the only person who truly understood and cared about Mrs. Edwards's welfare. The elderly woman's growing reliance on Velma's judgment extended beyond medical and household matters to include financial decisions that would have significant implications for both their futures. Velma gradually assumed responsibility for paying bills, managing bank accounts, and making purchases that she claimed were necessary for Mrs. Edwards's comfort and safety. Each expansion of authority was presented as a service that would reduce stress and simplify life for someone who deserved to spend her remaining years in peace and security. But Velma's definition of peace was very different from her client's expectations. She was already planning Mrs. Edwards' death while calculating exactly how much wealth could be extracted before that final solution became necessary. The art of manipulation she was perfecting would serve her well with future victims who would never suspect that their trusted caregiver was also their appointed executioner. Have you ever felt completely dependent on someone's care? Can you imagine how terrifying it would be to discover their true intentions? The autumn of Werned, 974 brought changes to the Edwards household that would have alarmed a more alert observer, but Dolly Edwards's increasing dependence on prescription medications had dulled her awareness to the point where she accepted Velma's explanations for anything unusual without question. The 77-year-old woman's daily routine now revolved entirely around medication schedules that Velma managed with the precision of a hospital nurse, though the purposes behind this pharmaceutical regimen had nothing to do with healing. Velma's medical experimentation had grown increasingly sophisticated as she gained access to Mrs. Edwards's prescription history and established relationships with her doctors. She had learned to describe symptoms during medical appointments that would result in prescriptions for specific medications, building an impressive collection of drugs that served her research purposes while maintaining the fiction that every pill was medically necessary for her client's well-being. The most valuable addition to her pharmacological arsenal was digitalis, prescribed for Mrs. Edwards's heart condition but administered by Velma in dosages that bore little resemblance to medical recommendations. In small amounts, digitalis could cause nausea, weakness, and confusion that would justify increased caregiving services and higher fees. In larger doses, it could precipitate heart failure that would appear entirely natural in a woman of Mrs. Edwards' age and medical history. But Velma's plans for Mrs. Edwards extended beyond simple murder for profit. She had discovered that her client possessed assets that could be acquired through careful manipulation of wills and financial documents, opportunities that required keeping the elderly woman alive long enough to execute legal changes while ensuring she remained too confused or dependent to understand the implications of what she was signing. The process of financial extraction began with small requests that seemed entirely reasonable. Permission to make purchases for household necessities, authority to pay bills from Mrs. Edwards's checking account, and access to bank statements for record-keeping purposes. Each concession was presented as a way to reduce stress and simplify Mrs. Edwards' life, while actually transferring control of her assets to someone who had no intention of using them for their stated purposes. Velma's forgery skills, developed through years of manipulating prescription forms and insurance documents, proved invaluable for creating financial instruments that appeared to bear Mrs. Edwards's signature but actually reflected Velma's decisions about asset distribution. Bank drafts, property deeds, and insurance beneficiary changes were executed during periods when Mrs. Edwards was heavily medicated and unable to focus on the documents she was supposedly signing. The most audacious part of Velma's scheme involved convincing Mrs. Edwards to name her as primary beneficiary in a revised will that would transfer the majority of her estate to the woman who had been caring for her with such apparent devotion. The legal changes were presented as a way to ensure that Velma could continue providing care without worrying about financial compensation, a fiction that Mrs. Edwards accepted as evidence of selfless dedication rather than calculated greed. By Christmas 1974, Dolly Edwards had unknowingly signed her own death warrant, while transferring her life savings to the woman who was already planning her funeral. Tell me in the comments, What safeguards do you think should be in place to protect elderly people from predatory caregivers like Velma? The final phase of Dolly Edwards's life began on January 29, 1975, when Velma decided that her client had outlived her usefulness and the time had come to collect on the investments she had made in establishing herself as the primary beneficiary of the elderly woman's estate. The method she chose reflected months of careful observation and experimentation, designed to appear as the natural progression of heart disease that had been documented in Mrs. Edwards's medical records for several years. The digitalis that had been a constant presence in Mrs. Edwards's medication regimen throughout the previous autumn now became a weapon delivered in doses calculated to overwhelm her cardiovascular system while maintaining the appearance of therapeutic administration. Velma's experience with the drug's effects had taught her exactly how much would be required to precipitate fatal heart failure without creating symptoms so dramatic that they would suggest poisoning rather than natural death. Mrs. Edwards's final illness followed a pattern that would become Velma's signature. Initial symptoms that suggested a worsening of existing medical conditions, followed by rapid deterioration that occurred too quickly for medical intervention to be effective. The elderly woman experienced weakness and nausea that Velma attributed to her ongoing heart problems, followed by confusion and difficulty breathing that appeared consistent with cardiovascular failure. Dr. Hutchins, called to examine Mrs. Edwards during what would prove to be her final day of life, found a patient whose symptoms aligned perfectly with end-stage heart disease. Her pulse was irregular and weak. Her blood pressure had dropped to dangerous levels, and her mental clarity had deteriorated to the point where meaningful communication was impossible. The physician's examination revealed nothing to suggest that her condition was anything other than the natural progression of cardiac problems that had been treated for months. Velma's performance during Mrs. Edwards' final hours was masterful, displaying exactly the right combination of grief, anxiety, and determination that would be expected from a devoted caregiver, watching her charge slip away despite heroic efforts to provide comfort and support. She maintained detailed records of symptoms and medication administration, presented herself as a knowledgeable advocate for her patients' needs, and demonstrated the kind of emotional investment that convinced everyone present that she was suffering genuine loss. When Dolly Edwards died on February 1st, 1975, her death was recorded as heart failure secondary to cardiac arrhythmia, a diagnosis that satisfied everyone involved and triggered insurance payments that would soon flow to the woman who had engineered her demise. The funeral was attended by neighbors who praised Velma's dedication and family members who expressed gratitude for the loving care their mother had received during her final months. But beneath the tears and expressions of sympathy, Velma was already calculating the value of her inheritance and evaluating potential future clients who might provide similar opportunities for profitable caregiving arrangements. Mrs. Edwards's death had been a complete success by every measure that mattered to her killer. Undetected, profitable, and socially beneficial to Velma's reputation as an exceptionally caring person. The pattern had been perfected, and Velma was ready to expand her operations to include multiple victims whose deaths would generate the income stream she needed to support her increasingly expensive lifestyle. Would you have suspected anything if you were a family member who visited during Mrs. Edwards' final illness, or accepted Velma's explanations as evidence of devoted care? The success of Dolly Edwards' murder transformed Velma from opportunistic killer into professional predator, as she recognized that systematic targeting of elderly clients could provide both steady income and social respectability that would shield her from suspicion while she accumulated wealth through carefully planned deaths. The $2,500 inheritance from Mrs. Edwards, combined with payment for caregiving services, demonstrated that murder could be a lucrative profession for someone with the right skills and temperament. Velma's next client was Montgomery Edwards, Dolly's elderly neighbor who had been impressed by the loving care she had provided during his friend's final illness. At 78, Montgomery lived alone in a farmhouse that had been in his family for 3 generations, his children having moved to distant cities where career opportunities outweighed family obligations. His diabetes and high blood pressure required daily medication management, while arthritis made household tasks increasingly difficult, creating exactly the combination of medical needs and social isolation that Velma had learned to exploit. The arrangement that brought Velma into Montgomery's household followed the same pattern she had established with Dolly Edwards. Initial services that appeared genuinely helpful, gradual assumption of responsibility for medical and financial matters, and systematic manipulation of the client's relationships with family members and medical professionals. But her approach to Montgomery reflected lessons learned from her previous experience, improvements in technique that would make detection even less likely. Velma's pharmaceutical knowledge had expanded significantly through her research into drug interactions, dosage calculations, and symptom management. She had developed relationships with multiple physicians across several counties, each unaware of the other's involvement in her medical care, allowing her to acquire a broader range of medications while maintaining the fiction that every prescription served a legitimate therapeutic purpose. The insulin that Montgomery required for diabetes management provided Velma with an ideal weapon that would be virtually undetectable if administered correctly. Unlike digitalis, which could be identified through autopsy examination, insulin overdoses typically left no physical evidence that would suggest poisoning rather than natural diabetic complications. The drug's effects could be controlled precisely, allowing her to create symptoms that justified increased caregiving fees while building toward a final dose that would cause death through hypoglycemic coma. But Velma's plans for Montgomery extended beyond simple murder for inheritance purposes. She had discovered that his property included valuable farmland that could be sold for development, bank accounts that contained more money than his modest lifestyle would suggest, and insurance policies that reflected his determination to provide for children who rarely visited or called. The potential profits from his death would far exceed anything she had gained from previous victims. The process of gaining Montgomery's trust and dependence followed familiar patterns, but Velma's growing confidence in her abilities allowed her to accelerate the timeline while taking greater risks that would have terrified her during earlier murders. She was becoming addicted to the power that came from controlling other people's lives and deaths, a psychological dependency that would prove far more dangerous than her reliance on prescription medications. Montgomery Edwards had no idea that his helpful caregiver was already planning his funeral while calculating exactly how much his death would be worth to her financial future. If you were Montgomery's distant family member, what questions would you have asked about his caregiver to ensure his safety? By the spring of 1976, Velma Barfield had killed Montgomery Edwards with the same methodical precision she had applied to previous victims, but this time the death generated consequences she hadn't anticipated. Montgomery's son, David Edwards, had maintained closer contact with his father than Velma realized, and his sudden death from apparent diabetic complications raised questions that wouldn't be dismissed as easily as previous fatalities had been. David Edwards was a bank manager in Harlot, whose professional experience with financial fraud had taught him to recognize patterns that suggested deliberate manipulation rather than coincidental events. When he arrived in Robeson County to settle his father's estate, he discovered financial irregularities that set off alarm bells honed through years of investigating embezzlement and forgery cases. The most obvious red flag was the series of large cash withdrawals from Montgomery's accounts during the final months of his life, transactions that occurred at times when his father would have been too ill to leave the house, let alone conduct banking business. The signatures on withdrawal slips bore subtle differences from Montgomery's usual handwriting, suggesting that someone else had been accessing his accounts with forged authorization. Even more disturbing was the revised will that had been executed just weeks before Montgomery's death, naming Velma Barfield as primary beneficiary of an estate worth considerably more than anyone had expected. The document had been witnessed by individuals who claimed to remember Montgomery signing it, but their descriptions of his mental state during the signing ceremony suggested someone who had been heavily medicated and possibly unaware of what he was authorizing. David's investigation into Velma's background revealed the extraordinary coincidence that she had been present for the deaths of not just Montgomery and Dolly Edwards, but also her two deceased husbands, all of whom had died from medical conditions that could have been exacerbated by medication tampering. The pattern was too consistent to ignore, suggesting deliberate planning rather than tragic luck. But David Edwards faced the challenge that would confront anyone attempting to prove Velma's guilt. The murders had been committed through methods that appeared to be natural deaths, leaving no physical evidence that would satisfy legal requirements for prosecution. Digitalis poisoning could be detected through specialized testing, but only if authorities knew to look for it, and had preserved biological samples that were typically discarded after routine autopsies. The insulin overdoses that had killed Montgomery would be even more difficult to prove, as the drug metabolized quickly and left no distinctive markers that would indicate poisoning rather than diabetic complications. Without confession or witness testimony, building a murder case against Velma would require investigative techniques and forensic expertise that rural law enforcement agencies were not equipped to provide. David Edwards found himself in the frustrating position of knowing that his father had been murdered, but lacking the evidence necessary to prove it in court. His complaints to local authorities were taken seriously, but produced no arrests, as investigators acknowledged the suspicious pattern while explaining that suspicion was not sufficient for criminal charges. Velma remained free to seek new victims, her reputation as a devoted caregiver enhanced by testimonials from grateful families who had no idea they were praising a serial killer. Tell me in the comments, if you were David Edwards, how would you have pursued justice for your father's murder when the evidence seemed impossible to obtain? Undeterred by David Edwards's suspicions, Velma Barfield continued expanding her caregiving operations throughout 1977, confident that her methods had been perfected to the point where detection was virtually impossible. Her reputation in the community had reached new heights following Montgomery Edwards's death, as neighbors praised her dedication and selflessness in caring for elderly clients who might otherwise have died alone and neglected. The financial rewards from her murders had allowed Velma to upgrade her lifestyle in ways that appeared modest but actually reflected careful calculation. She purchased a newer mobile, a home on Honeycutt Road, acquired a reliable car that would allow her to travel between clients without depending on others for transportation, and began dressing in clothes that suggested prosperity without ostentation. Each improvement was presented as the result of wise investments and frugal living rather than murder for profit. But the prescription drug dependency that had initially provided tools for killing had evolved into a personal addiction that threatened to compromise the careful planning that had made her crime successful. The pills that had once been instruments of murder were now necessities for managing her own psychological state, creating a dual dependency that made her both predator and victim of the same pharmaceutical weapons. Velma's need for medications had grown beyond what she could obtain through legitimate medical channels, forcing her to develop relationships with multiple doctors while maintaining elaborate deceptions about her symptoms and medical history. She had learned to present different ailments to different physicians, describing chronic pain conditions that would justify prescriptions for increasingly powerful drugs while avoiding the kind of detailed medical examination that might reveal her true physical condition. The combination of drug addiction and murder addiction created a psychological profile that would have fascinated criminal psychologists had anyone recognized what was developing in rural North Carolina. Velma had discovered that causing death provided a form of satisfaction that no other experience could match, while the prescription medications necessary for her killing methods had become essential for her own emotional stability. Her next victim was Record Lee, an elderly farmer whose property adjoined hers and who had mentioned his need for household help during casual conversations over the fence that separated their properties. At 84, Record represented the perfect combination of vulnerability and asset, as that Velma had learned to identify and exploit. His children lived in other states, his health required daily medication management, and his property included valuable farmland that could be sold for development purposes. The process of gaining Record Lee's trust followed patterns that Velma had refined through previous murders, but her growing recklessness was beginning to create inconsistencies that a more alert observer might have noticed. She was taking greater risks, accelerating timelines, and displaying confidence that bordered on arrogance as she assumed that her previous successes guaranteed future immunity from detection. Record Lee would become her fifth victim, but his death would finally provide authorities with the evidence they needed to recognize that a serial killer was operating in their community. The web of deception that had protected Velma for years was about to collapse under the weight of its own complexity. Would you have noticed if someone in your community seemed to be present for an unusual number of elderly deaths, or dismissed it as dedication to helping others? Record Lee's death on July 15, 1977, marked the beginning of Velma Barfield's downfall, though she had no way of knowing that her latest murder would finally provide law enforcement with the evidence needed to unravel her entire criminal enterprise. The 84-year-old farmer died in what appeared to be a tragic house fire that consumed his modest farmhouse during the pre-dawn hours, leaving investigators with a scene that seemed to tell the story of an elderly man who had fallen asleep while smoking and accidentally started a blaze that claimed his life. But the fire that was supposed to destroy evidence of Record Lee's murder instead preserved crucial clues that would expose Velma's method of operation. The autopsy required by the suspicious circumstances revealed levels of medications in Lee's system that far exceeded therapeutic dosages, including substances that had no legitimate reason to be present in an elderly diabetic farmer's bloodstream. Dr. Kermit Chandler, the medical examiner who conducted the autopsy, discovered concentrations of sedatives and heart medications that would have rendered Lee unconscious long before the fire began, suggesting that he had been deliberately incapacitated to prevent escape from the burning building. More importantly, the toxicology analysis revealed a chemical fingerprint that matched drugs commonly prescribed for conditions that Lee had never been diagnosed with, medications that could only have been obtained through the kind of doctor shopping that had become Velma's specialty. The investigation that followed Lee's death was conducted with a thoroughness that previous cases had not received, as the combination of fire and poisoning suggested premeditation that transformed what might have been treated as accidental death into obvious homicide. Detective Britt Hester of the Robeson County Sheriff's Department approached the case with suspicions already aroused by David Edwards's earlier complaints about his father's suspicious death. Hester's investigation revealed financial irregularities that mirrored those found in Montgomery Edwards's estate. Large cash withdrawals made during periods when Lee would have been too ill to conduct banking business, signatures on financial documents that appeared to be forgeries, and a hastily revised will that named Velma Barfield as primary beneficiary despite their relatively brief acquaintance. But the most damning evidence came from prescription records that showed Velma had been obtaining medications in Lee's name from multiple physicians across several counties, using forged prescriptions and fabricated symptoms to build a pharmaceutical arsenal that served no therapeutic purpose. The pattern of drug acquisition revealed systematic preparation for poisoning rather than legitimate medical treatment. When investigators obtained search warrants for Velma's mobile home, they discovered a medicine cabinet that contained enough controlled substances to stock a small pharmacy, including drugs that had been prescribed for patients who were now dead. The collection represented years of accumulation through methods that violated multiple federal and state laws governing controlled substance distribution. For the first time in her criminal career, Velma faced physical evidence that could not be explained through innocent coincidence or tragic bad luck. The web of deception she had constructed was finally collapsing, and there would be no escape from the consequences of her systematic murder campaign. If you were Detective Hester, what would you have done first upon discovering this evidence? How would you have built a case against someone who had been so careful for so long? The arrest of Velma Barfield on August 17, 1977, sent shockwaves through the rural communities of southeastern North Carolina, where her reputation as a devoted Christian caregiver had made her virtually above suspicion for the better part of a decade. The charges initially filed against her, murder in the first degree in the death of Record Lee, represented only the beginning of an investigation that would eventually encompass multiple jurisdictions and reveal the full scope of her systematic killing campaign. Detective Hester's interrogation of Velma, following her arrest, revealed a woman whose psychological makeup had been shaped by years of successful deception and murder. She maintained her innocence with the same convincing sincerity that had fooled doctors, family members, and community leaders throughout her criminal career, presenting herself as a victim of circumstances who had been wrongly accused based on circumstantial evidence and malicious gossip. But the physical evidence she collected from her mobile home told a different story entirely. The cache of prescription medications found in her possession included drugs that had been prescribed for every one of her victims, creating a pharmaceutical timeline that documented her systematic collection of murder weapons over a period of several years. Each bottle represented a specific crime: forged prescriptions, insurance fraud, or theft of medications from clients who had trusted her with their most intimate medical needs. The forensic analysis of financial records revealed the true scope of Velma's criminal enterprise. She had systematically exploited every client relationship for monetary gain, using combinations of theft, forgery, and inheritance fraud to extract wealth from victims before killing them to prevent discovery of her crimes. The pattern was consistent across all cases: an initial period of legitimate caregiving followed by gradually increasing financial manipulation that culminated in murder when the victim had been drained of accessible assets. Most disturbing was the discovery of detailed notes that Velma had maintained about her victims' daily routines, medical conditions, family relationships, and financial resources. These records revealed a level of planning and calculation that transformed her crimes from impulsive violence into premeditated business operations, where murder was simply the final step in a systematic process of exploitation. The investigation expanded to include examination of deaths in multiple counties, where Velma had provided caregiving services, as authorities realized that her known victims likely represented only a fraction of her total kill count. Medical records were subpoenaed, burial permits were reviewed, and insurance settlements were analyzed to identify additional cases where suspicious deaths had been attributed to natural causes. The process of building a comprehensive case against Velma required coordination between multiple agencies and jurisdictions, as her crimes had spread across county and state lines over a period of more than 8 years. Each potential victim required individual investigation to determine whether sufficient evidence existed to support murder charges, while maintaining the legal standards necessary for successful prosecution. The woman who had hidden behind a facade of Christian charity and grandmother-like kindness was finally being revealed as one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. Her victims had trusted her completely, never suspecting that their devoted caregiver was actually their appointed executioner. Tell me in the comments, what do you think motivated Velma more? The money she gained from murders, or the psychological satisfaction of controlling her victims' lives and deaths? On February 3, 1978, after months of maintaining her innocence despite overwhelming physical evidence, Velma Barfield finally confessed to the murders that had made her one of America's most prolific female serial killers. The confession came during a session with Dr. Dorothy Lewis, a psychiatrist who had been appointed to evaluate Velma's mental state and determine whether she was competent to stand trial for the crimes that had shocked North Carolina and captured national attention. The psychological pressure that finally broke Velma's facade of innocence had been building for months as investigators methodically dismantled every aspect of her carefully constructed life. The evidence against her had become so overwhelming that continued denials served no purpose beyond postponing the inevitable, while the prescription drug withdrawal she was experiencing in jail had stripped away the chemical buffers that had allowed her to maintain emotional equilibrium during her killing spree. Velma's confession was remarkable for its clinical detachment, as if she were describing crimes committed by someone else, rather than taking responsibility for actions that had destroyed multiple families. She admitted to poisoning Stuart Taylor, Dolly Edwards, Montgomery Edwards, and Record Lee, providing details about methods and motivations that only the killer could have known. But even in confession, she maintained that her actions had been driven by financial desperation rather than psychological compulsion, portraying herself as a victim of circumstances who had been forced into murder by poverty and addiction. The most chilling aspect of her confession was the matter-of-fact way she described selecting victims based on their vulnerability and assets, evaluating elderly clients like livestock being assessed for slaughter. She explained how she had gained their trust through displays of Christian charity and grandmother-like affection, then systematically exploited that trust to gain access to their medications, finances, and legal documents before killing them when they had outlived their usefulness. But Velma's confession also revealed psychological motivations that extended beyond simple greed. She described the sense of power and control that came from managing other people's lives and deaths, the satisfaction of successfully deceiving family members and medical professionals, and the addictive quality of murder that made each killing seem both easier and more necessary than the last. The confession provided closure for families who had suspected foul play but lacked evidence to prove their loved ones had been murdered. David Edwards finally received confirmation that his father had been killed for money, while other relatives learned that deaths they had attributed to natural causes had actually been carefully planned, executions carried out by someone they had trusted and welcomed into their homes. But the confession also raised disturbing questions about how many other victims might exist beyond those Velma was willing to acknowledge. Her criminal career had spanned nearly a decade and covered multiple states, creating opportunities for murders that might never be discovered or connected to her systematic killing campaign. The full scope of Velma Barfield's crimes would never be completely known, as she took secrets to her grave that would haunt investigators for years to come. Would you have been able to forgive someone like Velma if she had killed your family member, or would her confession have felt like too little, too late? The trial of Velma Barfield began on November 28, 1978, in the Robeson County Courthouse in Lumberton, North Carolina, drawing national media attention to a case that would challenge traditional perceptions about female serial killers and capital punishment. The proceedings took place in a community still reeling from the revelation that a woman they had regarded as a pillar of Christian virtue had systematically murdered trusted neighbors and clients over nearly a decade. Prosecutor Joe Freeman Britt, known throughout North Carolina for his aggressive pursuit of death penalty cases, approached Velma's trial with the thoroughness of someone who understood that this case would define his career and set precedents for how female serial killers were prosecuted in American courts. The evidence he presented painted a picture of premeditated murder motivated by greed, executed through methods that demonstrated sophisticated knowledge of pharmacology and human psychology. The prosecution's case relied heavily on the physical evidence collected from Velma's mobile home. The cache of prescription medications that had belonged to her victims, the forged financial documents that revealed systematic theft, and the detailed notes she had maintained about her clients' assets and vulnerabilities. Expert witnesses testified about the effects of various drugs found in the victims' systems, explaining how specific combinations could cause symptoms that mimicked natural illness while ultimately causing death through organ failure. But perhaps most damaging was the testimony of family members who described Velma's behavior during her victims' final illnesses. Their accounts revealed a pattern of manipulation and control that contradicted her claims of selfless caregiving, showing instead a calculating predator who had exploited grief and trust for financial gain while presenting herself as a devoted angel of mercy. Velma's defense team, led by attorney Bob Jacobson, faced the nearly impossible task of humanizing a defendant whose crimes had violated every sacred trust that held communities together. Their strategy focused on Velma's troubled childhood, her history of prescription drug abuse, and the desperate financial circumstances that they claimed had driven her to commit crimes that were foreign to her true nature. The defense presented expert testimony about the effects of chronic drug abuse on decision-making capacity, arguing that Velma's addiction had impaired her judgment to the point where she could not be held fully responsible for actions committed while under the influence of substances that altered her personality and moral reasoning. They portrayed her as a victim of medical malpractice who had been overprescribed medications that ultimately led to criminal behavior she would never have considered while sober. But the most significant challenge facing the defense was the systematic nature of Velma's crimes, which suggested planning and premeditation that contradicted claims of impaired judgment or diminished capacity. The evidence showed a defendant who had maintained detailed records, executed complex financial schemes, and successfully deceived multiple professionals over extended periods, capabilities that required the kind of sustained mental acuity that undermined arguments about drug-induced incompetence. The trial would ultimately force a jury to decide whether Velma Barfield deserved compassion as a victim of circumstances or condemnation as a cold-blooded killer who had betrayed the most fundamental bonds of human trust. If you had been on that jury, would you have been swayed by arguments about her troubled past and addiction, or focused solely on the calculated nature of her crimes? The testimony phase of Velma Barfield's trial brought forward witnesses whose accounts would forever change how the community of Robeson County understood the woman they had once revered as a model of Christian charity. Family members of her victims took the stand to describe their final interactions with loved ones who had died under Velma's care, their testimonies revealing details that painted a disturbing picture of systematic manipulation disguised as devotion. David Edwards provided the most compelling testimony about his father Montgomery's final months, describing phone conversations where the elderly man had expressed confusion about medications that Velma claimed his doctor had prescribed, and concerns about financial transactions he couldn't remember authorizing. Edwards's background in banking allowed him to present complex evidence about forged signatures and suspicious financial activities in terms that jurors could easily understand, creating a clear picture of premeditated theft that provided motive for murder. The medical testimony presented by Dr. Kermit Chandler proved crucial in establishing that the victims had died from poisoning rather than natural causes. His detailed explanation of how various drugs had been combined to create specific symptoms while avoiding detection during routine examinations revealed the sophisticated knowledge that Velma had acquired through years of experimentation with prescription medications. The autopsy findings showed levels of multiple substances that could only have been administered intentionally, not accidentally ingested or prescribed by legitimate physicians. Perhaps most damaging was the testimony of Velma's own children, who reluctantly provided accounts of their mother's behavior that contradicted the loving parent image she had cultivated in public. They described mood swings that coincided with her access to prescription medications, unexplained wealth that appeared after clients died, and strange experiments with their food and drinks that they had dismissed as quirky maternal behavior until investigators helped them understand the sinister implications. The prosecution's final witness was Dr. Dorothy Lewis, the psychiatrist, who had elicited Velma's confession. Her testimony provided insights into the psychological profile of a serial killer who had used society's expectations about grandmother figures to avoid suspicion while systematically murdering vulnerable victims. Lewis explained how Velma's presentation of herself as a caring caregiver had served as perfect camouflage for predatory behavior, allowing her to gain access to victims who would never have suspected danger from someone who embodied maternal nurturing. But the most chilling moment of the trial came when prosecutors played recordings of Velma's confession, allowing jurors to hear her matter-of-fact descriptions of selecting victims, planning their deaths, and covering up her crimes. Her voice, devoid of emotion or remorse, revealed the cold calculation behind actions that had destroyed multiple families while enriching a woman who had transformed caregiving into systematic murder. The cumulative effect of witness testimony was devastating to Velma's defense, creating an overwhelming picture of premeditated murder motivated by greed and executed with sophisticated planning that contradicted any claims of diminished capacity or impaired judgment. The evidence showed that Velma Barfield had not been a troubled woman driven to desperate acts, but a calculating predator who had chosen murder as a business model and refined her techniques over years of successful killing. What aspect of the witness testimony would have been most convincing to you if you had been following the trial? The financial evidence, medical testimony, or family accounts of her behavior? As the prosecution rested its case against Velma Barfield, her defense team faced the formidable challenge of convincing a jury that a woman who had confessed to multiple murders deserved mercy rather than the electric chair that awaited convicted killers in North Carolina. Attorney Bob Jacobson's strategy relied on presenting Velma as a victim of circumstances beyond her control, a woman whose childhood trauma and prescription drug addiction had created a perfect storm of psychological impairment that led to crimes she would never have committed under normal circumstances. The defense called expert witnesses who testified about the long-term effects of childhood abuse on adult behavior, explaining how Velma's exposure to domestic violence and poverty during her formative years had created psychological vulnerabilities that made her susceptible to addiction and poor decision-making. Dr. William Tyson, a psychiatrist specializing in trauma therapy, described how chronic stress during childhood could alter brain development in ways that impaired impulse control and moral reasoning throughout adult life. But the centerpiece of the defense strategy was testimony about Velma's prescription drug addiction, which attorneys argued had transformed a fundamentally decent woman into someone capable of unspeakable acts. Medical experts explained how chronic abuse of sedatives and painkillers could create psychological dependence that overwhelmed normal moral constraints, making users capable of behavior that would horrify them in sobriety. The defense presented evidence showing that Velma had been prescribed increasingly powerful medications by multiple doctors over a period of years, creating a pharmaceutical dependency that required ever-increasing doses to maintain basic psychological functioning. They argued that her crimes had been committed during periods of severe withdrawal or intoxication, when her judgment was so impaired that she could not be held fully responsible for actions that contradicted her fundamental nature. Character witnesses testified about Velma's reputation in the community before her arrest, describing a woman who had been regarded as exceptionally caring and generous, someone who had volunteered at church functions and provided assistance to neighbors without expectation of compensation. These testimonies were intended to demonstrate that her crimes represented an aberration caused by drug-induced personality changes, rather than expressions of her true character. The most emotional testimony came from Velma's own children, who described their mother's transformation from loving parent to unpredictable stranger as her drug addiction progressed. They spoke about their confusion and fear as they watched someone they loved become someone they no longer recognized, their accounts humanizing a defendant who had been portrayed as a calculating monster. But the defense's arguments faced the insurmountable challenge of explaining how someone with impaired judgment could have maintained the level of planning and deception required for successful serial murder. The systematic nature of Velma's crimes, the careful victim selection, sophisticated poisoning methods, and elaborate financial schemes suggested mental acuity that contradicted claims about drug-induced incompetence. The jury would have to decide whether Velma Barfield deserved compassion as a victim of addiction and circumstance, or condemnation as a predator who had used society's trust to facilitate systematic murder. The defense had made their case, but the evidence against their client remained overwhelming. If you believed someone's drug addiction had driven them to commit terrible crimes, would that influence your opinion about what punishment they deserved? On December 2, 1978, after deliberating for less than 4 hours, the jury returned with a verdict in the case of State of North Carolina versus Velma Barfield. The speed of their decision reflected the overwhelming nature of the evidence presented against the defendant, as well as the community's desire for justice in a case that had shattered fundamental assumptions about trust, safety, and the nature of evil in their midst. Guilty of murder in the first degree, the foreman announced, his words falling like a death sentence in the hushed courtroom, where Velma sat with the same composure she had maintained throughout the trial. The verdict meant that she would become the first woman sentenced to death in North Carolina since the reinstatement of capital punishment, a distinction that would make her case a focal point for national debates about gender, justice, and the appropriate punishment for serial murder. The penalty phase of the trial began immediately, as North Carolina law required the same jury to decide whether Velma would face execution or life imprisonment without possibility of parole. This phase allowed both sides to present additional evidence about aggravating and mitigating factors that should influence the ultimate punishment for crimes that had shocked the state and captured national attention. The prosecution argued that Velma's crimes met every criterion for capital punishment. They were premeditated, committed for financial gain, and involved multiple victims who had been especially vulnerable due to age and illness. Prosecutor Joe Freeman Britt emphasized the calculated nature of her murders, the systematic way she had exploited trust relationships, and the continuing danger she would pose to society if allowed to live. But perhaps most compelling was the prosecution's argument about the impact of Velma's crimes on the community's ability to trust caregivers and family members. Her actions had poisoned the most fundamental human relationships, making it impossible for elderly people to feel safe with those who claimed to care for them, and destroying the social bonds that held communities together. The defense's penalty phase arguments focused on Velma's potential for rehabilitation, her expressions of remorse following her confession, and the possibility that her crimes had been driven by addiction rather than fundamental evil. They presented testimony from prison officials about her model behavior since her arrest and her apparent spiritual transformation through intensive Bible study and prayer. Religious leaders testified about Velma's renewed faith and her potential to serve as a positive influence on other inmates if her life were spared. They argued that execution would serve no purpose beyond vengeance, while life imprisonment would allow her to make amends through service to others and continued spiritual growth. But the jury's decision reflected the community's judgment that some crimes transcended the possibility of redemption, that some betrayals of trust were so fundamental that they demanded the ultimate punishment. On December 2, 1978, Velma Barfield became the first woman sentenced to death in North Carolina's modern era. The grandmother who had killed everyone who trusted her would face the electric chair for crimes that had redefined evil in the American consciousness. Do you believe the death penalty was appropriate for Velma's crimes, or should society have chosen mercy over retribution, regardless of what she had done? Velma Barfield's arrival at North Carolina's Central Prison in Raleigh marked the beginning of a 6-year odyssey through the appeals process that would make her the most famous female death row inmate in American history. As the only woman among more than 70 condemned prisoners, she occupied a unique position in the criminal justice system that attracted attention from advocacy groups, religious organizations, and media outlets, fascinated by the phenomenon of a grandmother serial killer awaiting execution. The conditions of Velma's confinement were designed for male prisoners, as North Carolina had never before faced the challenge of housing a woman on death row. She was kept in isolation 23 hours per day, allowed out of her cell only for brief exercise periods and occasional visits from attorneys, spiritual advisors, and family members who struggled to reconcile the woman they knew with the monster whose crimes had been revealed during her trial. But perhaps the most remarkable transformation during her years on death row was Velma's apparent spiritual awakening, which became the centerpiece of her appeals for clemency and the focus of national debates about redemption, forgiveness, and the possibility of genuine change in even the most hardened criminals. She devoted herself to Bible study with an intensity that impressed prison chaplains and developed relationships with religious leaders who became convinced that her conversion was genuine rather than calculated. The appeals process that followed her conviction revealed weaknesses in her legal representation during trial, as subsequent investigations showed that her original attorneys had failed to present crucial evidence about her mental state and the effects of prescription drug addiction on her behavior. Appeals courts found that she had received inadequate counsel during the penalty phase of her trial, when arguments about mitigation could have influenced the jury's sentencing decision. But the legal technicalities that prolonged Velma's appeals paled in comparison to the broader cultural questions her case raised about gender, justice, and society's willingness to execute women who violated fundamental expectations about maternal behavior. Feminist organizations found themselves conflicted between opposing capital punishment and acknowledging that gender should not provide immunity from appropriate consequences for heinous crimes. The most compelling aspect of Velma's appeals was her apparent transformation into someone who acknowledged the full horror of her crimes while accepting responsibility for actions that had destroyed multiple families. Her letters to victims' relatives expressing genuine remorse, her work with other inmates struggling with addiction, and her cooperation with researchers studying serial killer psychology suggested a level of change that raised questions about the purpose of execution when rehabilitation appeared possible. But opponents of clemency argued that Velma's apparent spiritual transformation could not undo the systematic betrayal of trust that had characterized her crimes, nor restore life to victims who had died believing they were cared for by someone who actually viewed them as sources of profit. They contended that some actions transcended the possibility of forgiveness, regardless of subsequent repentance. As her execution date approached, Velma Barfield had become a symbol for competing visions of justice, mercy, and the capacity for redemption in American society. The decision about whether she would live or die would reflect fundamental beliefs about the nature of evil and the possibility of forgiveness. If someone who had committed terrible crimes appeared to have genuinely changed, would that influence your opinion about whether they deserved a second chance at life? At 2:15 a.m. on November 2, 1984, Velma Barfield became the first woman executed in the United States since 1962. Her death by lethal injection at Central Prison in Raleigh, marking the end of a case that had challenged American assumptions about female criminality, capital punishment, and the nature of evil itself. In her final hours, she maintained the spiritual composure that had characterized her years on death row, accepting her fate with a grace that stood in stark contrast to the calculating cruelty she had displayed during her killing spree. The execution attracted national attention as protests and vigils divided communities across North Carolina and beyond. Opponents of capital punishment argued that Velma's apparent spiritual transformation and her gender should have saved her from execution, while supporters of her death sentence maintained that her systematic betrayal of trust demanded ultimate punishment regardless of subsequent repentance or rehabilitation. In her final statement, Velma acknowledged the horror of her crimes, while accepting responsibility for actions that had destroyed families and violated the most fundamental bonds of human trust. "I want to say that I am sorry for all the hurt that I have caused," she said, her words carrying the weight of someone who had spent 6 years contemplating the full implications of her actions. "I know that my words cannot bring back the people I killed or undo the damage I have done." The method of execution, lethal injection rather than the electric chair, reflected North Carolina's recent adoption of what was considered a more humane form of capital punishment, though the irony was not lost on observers who noted that Velma herself had used pharmaceutical methods to kill her victims. She died peacefully, without the violent struggle that had characterized the final moments of those she had poisoned. The aftermath of Velma's execution sparked ongoing debates about the intersection of gender, crime, and punishment in American society. Her case had proven that women were capable of systematic serial murder on a scale that challenged traditional assumptions about female criminality, while her apparent spiritual transformation raised questions about the purpose of capital punishment when genuine repentance seemed possible. But perhaps the most lasting impact of Velma Barfield's crimes was the way they had forever changed how society viewed caregivers and the vulnerability of elderly people who depended on others for their basic needs. Her systematic exploitation of trust relationships had poisoned fundamental assumptions about safety and care, creating awareness of predatory behavior that could hide behind facades of Christian charity and maternal devotion. The grandmother who had killed everyone who trusted her had paid the ultimate price for crimes that redefined evil in American consciousness. Her death provided closure for victims' families while raising questions that would continue to influence discussions about justice, mercy, and the capacity for redemption long after her execution. The pattern of systematic murder disguised as caregiving had been broken forever, but the scars left by her betrayal of trust would take generations to heal. I want to hear your theory in the comments below. Do you believe Velma's spiritual transformation was genuine, or was it simply another manipulation designed to save her own life?